Have you ever felt like something was wrong, but no one believed you? What if, when you finally worked up the courage to speak up, you were accused of exaggerating, of being paranoid? I know exactly what it's like. I've been there. I'm Sarah Johnson, and today I'm going to tell you a story that goes much deeper than simple betrayal. It's about what happens when someone you love breaks your trust, and even worse, when you start to doubt yourself. I know you're thinking, another betrayal story, right? But trust me, what I have to share isn't just about what he did, but about what he made me believe about myself. Because when pain hits, it's natural for us to seek answers. And over time, I realized that the biggest battle wasn't against him, but against the lies I'd begun to believe about my worth. Am I really worthy of love? Was it my fault? Am I crazy for feeling the way I do? These questions began to dominate my mind, and with each negative answer, I felt myself losing a little more of my faith, my self-esteem, and my inner peace. Do you recognize yourself in this experience? The feeling of being invalidated, of living in a minefield of judgment and silencing, and of questioning your own sanity? Maybe you're going through something like this now, or have experienced something similar in the past, or perhaps you know someone who finds themselves in this situation. What I want to show you is that what I experienced isn't the end of the story, and that our true strength lies in how we overcome it all. I know it may seem hard to believe, but the next fact might change your perspective. So, if you're willing to continue this journey with me, I promise the end will be worth it. Because despite everything I've been through, and the lies that nearly made me lose my way, I found something that restored me, something much stronger than the pain of betrayal. And in a moment, I'll share what happened next. But for now, I want you to ask yourself, what would it be like to live your life without the doubts and insecurities that betrayal leaves us with? Let's find out together. I'm Sarah Johnson, 36 years old, and a while ago, my life seemed perfect. Married, a mother, faithful to my faith. It seemed like I had everything a woman could want: a close-knit family, a home full of love, and a life planned out, just as I'd always dreamed. But, as many of us know, what seems to be going well can fall apart in the blink of an eye. And that's what happened to me. One night, a simple discovery, something that couldn't be ignored, turned my world upside down. I didn't know whether to feel sad, angry, or completely lost. The only thing I knew was that something was very wrong. And worst of all, no one believed me. I began to question myself every day if I was crazy, if I was really seeing what was right in front of me. As someone who had always had faith, as a Christian, I felt lost, as if I were being punished for something I hadn't even done. And that feeling of confusion was the most painful. Imagine for a moment that you begin to doubt your own perception, what is real and what is not. I began to ask myself, am I exaggerating? Am I the one creating a problem where there is none? Until the facts became so clear, so visible, that I could no longer deny them. And the hardest part of all, the people around me, the ones I trusted most, also doubted me. They didn't see what I saw, didn't feel what I felt. It was as if, by sharing my pain, I was carrying an even greater weight, the judgment of those who couldn't or wouldn't see the truth. At first, I thought maybe I was wrong, but soon I realized my pain was valid. And yet, every time I tried to vent, I felt more alone, as if no one was willing to listen or understand what was happening to me. It was a long and painful process, but something began to happen. I was forced to look within myself, to question my self-esteem, my faith, my decisions. I was trying to understand how a woman of faith, who had always done everything right, found herself in such a painful and desolate place. How could someone who had prepared so much, who had given so much of herself, be betrayed like this? But the truth, though difficult, began to reveal itself, and it was precisely at that moment that I realized that more than the pain of betrayal, the greatest impact was what it had on me. The lies I'd begun to believe about who I really was. Sometimes we need to look within, even when we don't want to discover that we have the strength to start over. And that's what I had to do. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but looking back at my own journey, I realized that true transformation begins when you decide to stop believing the lies the world and people try to impose on you. And when you do, something changes. The way you see the world, the way you see yourself, and above all, the the way you reconnect with what truly matters. What came after that was a turning point, an awakening to something deeper, something I never imagined I'd be able to find amidst the pain. And though I hesitated to share it all, I now know that my story isn't just mine. It can be yours too, because ultimately, the journey of healing and self-discovery is something we all need to experience. When I got married, I thought I'd find a life partner, someone with whom I could face every hardship, share every dream, and most importantly, grow together in faith. The idea of sharing every moment, good and bad, seemed like the perfect foundation for building a stable and loving life. I was in love, completely invested in everything that relationship represented. He seemed to be everything I'd hoped for: dedicated, kind, someone who shared the same values and who made me believe that together, as a Christian couple, we could face any challenge. I remember the excitement of our wedding day well, the packed church, the vows exchanged with that sincere smile, the promise to be by his side through thick and thin. Back then, I believed that love would be enough to overcome anything, and that with faith in God, we would always find a way to solve our problems. It was a mindset I carried with great pride. Marriage would be my anchor, and with it, I would face everything. But life, as everyone knows, isn't just about perfect moments, and I soon realized that the promises of eternal love, even with all my faith, were being tested in ways I hadn't expected. At first, it was something small, almost imperceptible. Small gestures, flaws I preferred to ignore because deep down I thought that with time everything would fall into place. After all, love was enough, wasn't it? But time passed, and these small signs began to grow. There was a distance, a coldness that I couldn't explain. I felt disconnected, as if I were trying to touch a person who, however close they were physically, was no longer the same as before. I didn't know what to do with this feeling. Something was wrong. But what? I tried not to think about it too much, believing it was just a difficult phase, a tiring routine that would soon pass. After all, isn't that what we tell ourselves when we love someone? That the bad times will pass? But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just a phase. Something bigger was at play, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth. My faith told me to be patient, to believe in the best. But what happens when the best starts to seem distant? What happens when the promises made before God start to crumble? I needed to understand what was happening, but something inside me told me the answer wouldn't be easy. Something inside me knew the truth I was about to discover wouldn't be anything like I'd imagined. And the scariest thing of all was that somehow I was already beginning to realize the answers wouldn't lie in the other person, but in myself. But something started to change, and I felt it. Sometimes we feel it, right? That intuition, that sixth sense, that alerts us even before we have concrete proof. In my case, it was a sensation that made me stop for a moment and take a closer look at what was happening. It was almost imperceptible, but I knew deep down that it wasn't just my mind trying to create problems. Something was off, and that feeling began to grow within me. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, who would want to face this reality? Who would choose to plunge into this abyss when life seemed peaceful on the outside? But the more I tried to close my eyes, the more the feeling of unease grew. I saw small signs that, if I were completely honest with myself, I knew weren't normal. Deleted messages on my phone, frequent absences without plausible explanations, changes in behavior. None of these signs, in isolation, seemed significant enough to raise an alarm. But together, they began to form a picture I didn't want to see. My mind, which had already been trained to trust, was beginning to question everything. The trust I had in him, and worse, the trust I had in myself. As time passed, I began to feel more vulnerable, more unprotected. I didn't want to be that woman who doubted everything, but I couldn't deny what was right in front of me. And what made me question even more was the fact that deep down, I knew he was also aware of what was happening. Something was being hidden, and what haunted me most was the fact that I had no way of knowing the truth, not without a direct confrontation, something I wasn't prepared for. I feared the answers, feared what I would discover, and even with all these signs, the doubt remained. Am I exaggerating? Am I seeing things where they aren't there? These questions tormented me every day. I desperately wanted it to be just my mind creating a plot, that it was nothing more than my paranoia. But at the same time, something inside me knew it wasn't. It wasn't just a woman's instinct. It was something deeper, more real. I began to question whether I should confront him. But how can I do that without knowing for sure? How can I prove something I feel but can't prove with clear evidence? That's when lies, doubt, and pain began to infiltrate every aspect of my life. I didn't know what to do anymore. What truly tormented me was the silence. The fact that I couldn't scream, couldn't ask for help without appearing weak or incapable. But at the same time, I knew something was happening. And what I didn't know was that, from that moment on, the journey to understanding the truth would begin to change everything. I've been asked about this feeling many times. You're being paranoid, Sarah. You're overreacting. And you know what's hardest? When these words don't come from strangers, but from the people you love most. From friends, family, the people who should be there for you, supporting and believing in you. At first, I tried to ignore it, try to deal with it alone, but the comments began to echo in my mind. Am I really overreacting? I wondered. Am I going crazy, creating a story where nothing exists? Doubt began to erode my confidence, making me question my own perception of reality. I no longer knew what to think. My heart and mind were in constant conflict. On one hand, there was the pain of realizing something wasn't right, something I couldn't explain but felt so clearly. And on the other, I felt disbelieved, as if my feelings were trivial, as if I were creating problems where none existed. The word paranoid kept hammering away at me, and at a certain point, I began to wonder if it wasn't my fault. Maybe I was being dramatic, overly sensitive. Maybe I really was an insecure wife, unable to deal with the difficulties of her marriage. Was my faith so shaken that I was beginning to create a storyline that wasn't real? And worst of all was when I started believing these accusations. Not that I wanted to, but doubt crept into me so deeply that at some point I believed it might be my fault. If he said everything was fine, that I was seeing things where there was nothing, who was I to question it? As a Christian, I believed that trust should be unshakable, that love was enough to overcome any crisis. And this began to blind me to the truth I was trying to hide. This internal doubt forced me to withdraw from myself. I found myself trying to force a reality that didn't make sense, trying to find explanations that would justify his behavior. Every time I sought an answer that would give me peace, I ended up more lost. I was trying to make my faith work in a way that, deep down, made me continue to ignore the pain growing inside me. I didn't want to accept the idea that what I felt was real. I didn't want to face the possibility that I was being deceived. But at the same time, I knew something was wrong. And the more I tried to deny it, the more the feeling of emptiness took over. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't exaggeration. It was just a woman trying to understand what was happening in her life. But the lie became so strong that I began to question my own sanity. It was at this point, when I was so full of doubt, that the truth began to seep in. The truth, however, didn't come easily. It hid behind excuses, sweet words, and empty promises. But it was there, waiting to be discovered. I knew I needed to stop denying it, stop deceiving myself. But how? How could I accept that the life I had built, the trust I had placed in it, was being destroyed from the inside out? I knew the answer lay within me, but I was also afraid of the answer. And as difficult as it was, the only way to find peace was to confront the truth, no matter how painful. And it was at that moment, when doubt gnawed at me to the point of almost losing myself, that a revelation began to unfold. Something within me began to grow stronger, something I hadn't expected, but which would give me the courage to finally face what was happening. Because in facing the pain and the lies, I found something far more powerful, the strength to rebuild my life. And it was only then that I realized that the journey of healing, though difficult, was the only way to find true peace. As a Christian, I felt guilty for questioning my faith. God had given me this husband, and what was I thinking? How could I doubt something he had given me? I tried to remember all the promises I had made before God, at the altar, and the faith I had always carried. At that time, my faith seemed unshakable, firm. I believed with all my heart that God had a purpose for everything, even the hardships. But as time passed, the pain of seeing the relationship I had so trusted in crumble made me question everything I had ever believed in. How could I feel so lost? How could I feel so deceived? Wasn't that what faith was supposed to protect me from? I knew that difficulties were part of the process, that challenges in a couple's life are inevitable. But when you find yourself in a situation where trust has been broken so profoundly and emptiness takes over, it's difficult to maintain the certainty that everything has a purpose. Not only did I doubt my relationship, but I began to doubt myself, my own ability to interpret God's will. How could I trust my judgment when everything seemed to be falling apart around me? How could I believe that God was still with me when what I felt was a mixture of pain and loneliness? With each prayer, I asked for answers, but the answers I received were hazy, and the silence seemed to suffocate me more each day. I could no longer discern between what was my inner voice, my insecurities, and what was God's voice guiding me. My faith, once such a steadfast strength, now felt like a fragile rope, almost breaking. And the most painful thing was that when I tried to talk about it with others, I didn't receive the understanding I expected. "It's a test of faith," they said. "You need to forgive, to trust God more." But how could I forgive? How could I trust when the pain was so great and the doubt so strong? How could I believe that everything would happen according to God's plan when I was in the midst of such a violent emotional storm? It was at this moment of internal crisis, when the pain seemed unbearable and my faith was being tested in every way, that I began to question something I never imagined I would: my own relationship with God. If He gave me this husband, how could He allow me to go through all of this? It was difficult to accept, but the truth began to reveal itself. My faith didn't need to be unshakable all the time, and suffering wasn't a reflection of a lack of faith. Pain was part of the journey, and how I chose to face it would define the transformation that was to come. Gradually, I realized that my relationship with God didn't have to be perfect to be strong. That, in moments of darkness, it was precisely in the process of questioning myself, of allowing myself to be vulnerable, that my faith could grow more deeply. And maybe, just maybe, that was what He wanted me to learn. But the hardest part was yet to come, the final step toward accepting the truth that, until then, I had been unable to face. I tried to ignore the signs. You know when something inside you screams, but you pretend you didn't hear it? That's exactly what happened. I saw the signs, noticed the small changes, the words that didn't fit, the apologies that sounded hollow. But instead of allowing myself to truly feel what was happening, I tried to pretend nothing was wrong. I was calm, accepting His apology, even when something inside me told me otherwise. I didn't want to be the jealous wife, the woman who dwells on every little detail, who constantly questions everything. I didn't want to be that woman, you know? Because deep down, I feared that by doing so, I would be confirming my worst insecurities, the ones that were already there, even before all this pain began. I feared being the one who is overly suspicious, the one who can't trust anything or anyone. And I didn't want to be that woman. I wanted to be the one who believed, who had faith, who trusted no matter what. But this desire to keep everything peaceful, to not create any more conflict, was destroying me from within. I believed that if I continued to ignore it, everything would pass. That if I was patient enough, if I held on longer, maybe the situation would change. Maybe He would see me as a strong, understanding wife. I deluded myself with the idea that time would solve everything, and that love would prevail. And so I ended up convincing myself that it was easier to live this comfortable lie. This lie that if I accepted His mistakes without question, everything would be fine. That if I continued to believe He would change, it would make reality more bearable. I clung to this lie because it made me feel that somehow I still had control over the situation. It made me feel like I was doing the right thing, maintaining harmony. But deep down, I knew I was just sweeping the problem under the rug, pretending I didn't see what was happening. The pain of watching the situation continue, with nothing truly resolved, grew within me, becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And worst of all, even as I tried to make everything seem okay, something inside me was breaking. The trust, already fragile, was slowly fading. Every lie, Every excuse I accepted was like a brick in the construction of an invisible wall between us. This wall grew higher and higher, to the point where I could no longer see a way through it. I didn't want to be that woman who gave in to distrust, but I was becoming that person. And the more I tried to keep up appearances, the more the pain of reality began to weigh on me. I didn't know how to break out of this spiral, but something inside me told me that what I was doing wasn't right. I knew that if I didn't face what was happening, it wouldn't just be the relationship that would be lost, but also my very identity. I was losing myself trying to save something that, perhaps, had already been broken for a long time. This began to make me reflect. How far was I willing to go to maintain a facade of perfection? And it was in this moment of reflection that the truth, the one I had tried so hard to avoid, began to slowly emerge, bringing with it the pain of an awakening. But then, I discovered it. Something that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a big revelation, nor a dramatic scene like you see in movies. It was just a small, almost insignificant detail, but it suddenly made everything fit together in a way I hadn't wanted to see. It was something simple, something he probably wouldn't even imagine I'd notice, but it was enough to give me a knot in my stomach and make my world fall apart. Something so small, yet so big to me. I remember the exact moment, the chill that ran down my spine, and the question that immediately popped into my mind. What now? What do I do with this? It was hard. You know, I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to continue with the comfortable lie, the one that told me that if I closed my eyes and pretended nothing was happening, things would get better. But deep down, I knew that was no longer possible. This small detail made me realize what I'd suspected for some time, but had been avoiding accepting. He was cheating on me. The betrayal didn't come in a grandiose way, like a scandal. There were no explosions or major confrontations. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the pain it brought was immense. I felt it. I knew something wasn't right, but for so long, I refused to see the truth. I was so caught up in protecting the relationship, preserving the image of the perfect couple, that I kept pushing my intuition away. But that small detail was like an awakening, something I could no longer ignore. I knew I had to face the truth, and it scared me. I knew that by doing so, the entire reality I had constructed in my mind would crumble. He hadn't deceived me just in that moment. The lie was there, seeping into every gesture, every excuse, every sorry. It was a mistake. And the hardest part of all was realizing that for so long I had deluded myself, trying to convince myself that what I felt wasn't real. I began to wonder how I had gotten this far, how I had allowed myself to live in this illusion, even when my heart already knew the answer. It was a whirlwind inside me, a mixture of anger, sadness, confusion, and above all, profound pain. I never imagined I would experience something like this, and yet here I was, faced with something I could no longer hide from myself. Realizing he was cheating was the first step toward facing an even more difficult truth, that for too long I had neglected my own feelings, my own needs, in the name of a relationship that, in reality, had long since broken. And it was at that moment, when the pain became inescapable, that the questions began to emerge clearly and forcefully. What do I do now? And the answer, however difficult it was to accept, began to emerge slowly, between the lines of everything I had previously ignored. But to understand what truly needed to be done, I would have to look within myself in a way I never had before. I was afraid to confront him, afraid of the truth, and the worst part, afraid of being judged, afraid of being seen as an insecure, unbalanced woman, someone who couldn't handle her own feelings. Because, I don't know if you've noticed, but when you start questioning someone, the doubt doesn't just stay between the two of you. It spreads, like a virus, and the people around you start to see you differently. Then comes the judgment. You're being dramatic. You're making up a problem where there isn't one. And that's something no one wants to face, especially when you're already struggling with the turmoil of emotions within yourself. The fear of being seen like this paralyzed me. I found myself torn between the pain of betrayal and the desire to keep everything intact, to preserve the image of the perfect relationship people expected of me. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that if I didn't say anything, Maybe things would work themselves out, that if I just kept the pain to myself, things could go back to the way they were before. But the more I tried to hide what was happening, the more the truth hurt. It was like I was swallowing an immense weight, a weight that was slowly suffocating me. I felt weak, vulnerable, and at the same time, the fear of confronting him made me believe I would be seen as out of control, as someone who couldn't handle the situation. The fear of being the woman who was exaggerating and seeing things where there was nothing prevented me from taking action. How could I question the man I'd built my life with, whom I thought I knew inside and out? I wondered if this was just a phase in my head, a passing out caused by my own insecurity. And this doubt, this fear, only made the silence grow. Furthermore, the fear of the impact of the truth consumed me. What would happen next? If I spoke, if I confronted it, the truth could destroy everything. I knew that by touching that wound, there would be no going back. Whatever was revealed, the consequences would be profound. I was about to open a door to something I didn't know how to deal with, something that, deep down, might be irreparable. But the fear of continuing to live with this doubt, of remaining in this place of denial, was also eating away at me. The pain of silence was more unbearable than any confrontation, and as time passed, I knew something had to change. I could no longer live in this anguish. The truth, however painful, was the only way out. I knew that facing this reality would force me to make decisions that would challenge me to look at my life, at myself, in a completely new way. I just didn't know yet where this would take me. I knew I would have to deal with the consequences, but what I still didn't fully understand was that, deep down, the only thing I really needed to do was allow myself to be true to myself. And that, in itself, would be a huge step. And when I finally spoke up, what I heard was, "You're overreacting. This is all in your head." I no longer knew who to trust, not even my own instincts. I was completely lost, trying to understand my reality, and by seeking support, I ended up feeling even more alone. I hoped at least to be heard, that the people around me would understand what I was feeling. But what I found was a series of reactions that made me question everything I was experiencing. The words of those I considered close to me hit me deeply, more than I could have imagined. "You're being dramatic" became a kind of echo in my head, and each time I heard it, the guiltier I felt for feeling what I was. I just wanted to understand what was happening, but what I found were empty excuses, a silent distancing from the people who, until then, had been a constant support. With each judgment I heard, my self-confidence faded a little further. How could I be right if others didn't see what I saw? How could I be right when everything around me seemed to say otherwise? This feeling of not being understood was devastating. I found myself surrounded by a multitude of people who couldn't or wouldn't understand what I was going through. My friends, my family, no one seemed willing to give me the support I so desperately needed at that moment. I began to wonder, was I really wrong? Was my pain a figment of my imagination? Worst of all was the fear of being seen as weak, as someone who couldn't handle the situation. As if, by talking about my pain, I was somehow making myself look inferior. Judgment often comes not just from others, but from ourselves, and it made me doubt what I knew to be true. Was I really overreacting? Was I being weak, insecure, too vulnerable? I no longer knew which path to take. The silence that followed my outbursts was like an even greater weight, making me feel invisible. I no longer knew if I was seeking support from the right people or if I was losing my way. This judgment made me close the doors to my own truth even further, and for a moment, I thought it might be better to leave everything behind and move on, ignoring what was happening. But even in the silence and doubt, something inside me still screamed that I needed to understand the reality of what was happening. I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face the truth, even if it meant losing even more control. And it was in this moment of uncertainty, when external judgments were taking over, that I realized the biggest battle I faced wasn't against him or what others thought, but against my own fears and insecurities. In those moments, I felt alone with my pain, with my faith, trying to understand what God wanted of me. I found myself on an internal journey where sadness seemed to consume me and answers were increasingly difficult to find. The people around me who had previously supported me seemed distant, and I didn't know how to explain what was happening inside me. How could I explain a pain so deep, so personal, that even I didn't know where it came from? I felt lost, as if I were in a place where no one could reach me anymore. Loneliness didn't just come from the physical absence of others, but from the feeling that no one truly understood the magnitude of what I was experiencing. I was a woman of faith, but now I was constantly questioning myself. Where was God in this? How could He, who had given me so much, allow me to go through something like this? I wanted to understand, but with every prayer, every attempt to connect with Him, I felt an even greater emptiness. The pain seemed to be taking me away from the peace I so desperately sought. I felt like I was in a desert, searching for answers that never came. And the worst part was that, even though I knew faith should give me strength, I felt fragile. I wanted to believe, but the doubt grew stronger and stronger. Sometimes the pain was so intense that I felt like I couldn't go on. I looked at my life and felt that the trust, security, and joy that had once existed were completely destroyed. But even so, something inside me told me that I needed to move on, that there was a purpose in all of this, even if I couldn't yet see it. I was afraid that by giving in to the pain and despair, I would lose my faith completely. But at the same time, I could no longer deny the impact the betrayal was having on me. I felt like a broken woman, trying to pick up the pieces of a relationship that had once seemed so perfect. I didn't know how to free myself from this loneliness that consumed me. What hurt most was not being able to talk about what was happening, as if my pain were something invisible. Each day felt like an internal struggle, and with every step I took, the weight of doubt, distrust, and pain made me question whether I could find a way to rebuild everything that was falling apart around me. But as alone as I felt, something inside me told me that this journey of pain was not in vain. I didn't yet know how, but something inside me was beginning to transform. The pain, as unbearable as it was shaping me into something greater, something I would only begin to understand as I continued walking. I wanted to believe that God was giving me strength, but I couldn't understand how He could allow this. The betrayal, the abandonment, the feeling of being invisible, of being unseen, it all consumed me inside. I was desperately trying to hold on to my faith like a foundation, but it felt like it was crumbling, piece by piece. As someone who had always trusted God, who believed that He had a purpose in all things, I now found myself questioning even His presence in my life. I knew that faith was supposed to help me overcome adversity, but at that moment, it seemed to slip through my fingers like fine sand. The pain of betrayal was a pain I never imagined I would feel. It wasn't just about the broken trust in my relationship, but a profound sense that I had been betrayed by something even greater, the very faith that sustained me. How could this happen? How could God allow something so cruel, something that made me question my worth, my identity? I felt lost, disoriented, and the question that kept gnawing at my mind was, why would He allow me to go through this? Doubt mixed with fear, and the more I tried to search for answers, the more distant they became. I knew God loved me, but sometimes that didn't seem enough. I felt like He saw me suffering, but somehow I was being left alone in my grief. I didn't know how to process the pain of betrayal without completely losing my trust in God. The pain wasn't just about what He did, but about how I began to question myself. Why hadn't I seen the signs? Why had I continued to ignore what my heart already felt? God was teaching me something, but I couldn't understand what. Each tear felt like another doubt, and at the same time, I felt guilty for not having the strength to see God's greater plan for me. The impact was profound, but at the same time, it began to open space for deeper reflection on my own faith journey. I began to realize that perhaps my faith didn't need to be perfect all the time, that pain and questioning are also part of the growth process. And even though I didn't understand the reason for all of this, there was something inside me that told me that, in the end, this pain would be the key to a transformation I couldn't yet see. But to achieve this, I would have to face my pain head-on, unafraid to question, unafraid to cry, and, most importantly, unafraid to allow myself to be transformed. And it was at that moment that I found strength within myself. It wasn't a strength that came from outside, it wasn't something someone gave me, but something that was there all along, waiting to be discovered. I didn't know it, but the pain, the doubt, and the fear were preparing me for an encounter with a version of myself I never imagined I was capable of being. When you find yourself facing such a difficult situation, where all certainties seem to have been ripped away from you, it's easy to lose yourself. But it was in that void, in that moment of total uncertainty, that something inside me began to change. The faith that had seemed so fragile, so shaken, began to become the foundation on which I stood. I began to realize that my faith didn't have to be perfect. It didn't have to be unshakable all the time. It was precisely in my fragility that I found my strength. It was as if the pain had broken something inside me, and at the same time, created space for something new to grow. I was no longer trying to fight what was happening, but I was beginning to accept that, to get out of this, I would need more than just the courage to carry on. I needed an internal transformation, something that would allow me to see beyond the pain, beyond the betrayal, beyond the loss. With every prayer, with every moment of stillness, I realized that the faith that sustained me wasn't about not falling, but about rising, even in the most difficult circumstances. The woman I became wasn't one who ignored pain. She was a woman who learned to face it head-on. I found myself rebuilding my confidence, not in the idea of a perfect marriage, but in the confidence that I was enough. I was enough for myself. I was strong enough to handle whatever came my way, because instead of losing myself in lies and pain, I began to lean on the truth that was revealing itself. My true strength lay not in dependence on anyone, but in my relationship with God, in my relationship with myself. This Christian woman I so desperately sought to be didn't lie in an image of perfection, but in the acceptance of my humanity, my journey, my struggles, and my overcoming. It was then that I began to understand that true transformation comes not only in moments of triumph, but in the battles we face alone. The sleepless nights, the prayers that seemed unheard, the tears no one saw. All these small victories were not in vain. They made me stronger. They gave me the confidence I needed to walk towards something new. I was beginning to rebuild myself, not based on what others thought of me, but based on the truth God had already planted within me. This transformation was the first step on an even, deeper journey where my identity would be reestablished, but in ways I never imagined. And you know what's hardest? The silencing. When you start speaking out, you realize people prefer to look away, as if your suffering were invisible, as if your pain wasn't adequate. In a community where faith should be the foundation of everything, where love for others should be a priority, I found myself silently excluded. I expected to be understood, or at least heard, but instead, I began to feel like my pain was a nuisance to others. It was as if my lament was too uncomfortable to speak aloud, as if I were breaking some unspoken rule. Instead of empathy, I received judgmental looks, whispers, and a silence that weighed more heavily than any words that could have been spoken. The people who should have welcomed me, those with whom I shared my faith, began to pull away. I understood what they were thinking. What I was saying about my marriage, about my pain, was challenging an image everyone wanted to preserve. In that environment, where perfection seemed to be the expectation, I felt out of place, as if my suffering were a stain on what should have been a flawless life. I didn't want to be a person who brought discomfort, who made others feel bad about the situation I found myself in. But at the same time, I could no longer hide what was inside me. Perhaps the worst part was realizing that what I was feeling wasn't seen as a valid struggle. While everyone around me talked about overcoming, about trusting in God, I felt like I was being left aside, as if my pain were small compared to the bigger picture of faith. The loneliness, this silent loneliness, was what hurt me most. Because when you feel invisible, you begin to doubt yourself. You begin to question whether your pain has value, whether your feelings are truly legitimate. And in the midst of all this, the church, the place that should have been a refuge, began to seem more distant than ever. I was being silenced, not only by the words of others, but by my own fear that my pain would not be well received. That's when I realized how difficult it is to speak the truth when it defies the expectations of everyone around you. The silence suffocated me, But at the same time, it forced me to look within myself and discover a strength I didn't even know I possessed. I was being brought to a point of transformation where pain became not only a part of my story, but also an invitation to a deeper journey. And, although the path was still uncertain, the need to speak, to be heard, to find a space where my truth was valid, became increasingly clear. I didn't yet know how or when, but I knew I had to continue my search for this freedom. I wasn't seeking judgment. I wanted to be heard. I wanted the people around me to understand that my pain wasn't just about betrayal, but about feeling misunderstood. I wasn't looking to be told what to do or how to feel. I just needed someone to truly listen to me, without judgment, without rushing to offer advice or quick fixes. Sometimes the pain is so great that we don't need answers. We just want to be acknowledged. We want our pain validated, our humanity seen. And in that moment, that's all I wanted, to be heard, to be embraced. The feeling of being alone in my grief became even more acute when I realized that, although I was surrounded by people, none of them seemed able to understand what I was going through. I began to wonder if perhaps I was asking too much, if my pain was too exaggerated for those around me to understand. But at the same time, I felt it shouldn't be this way. My pain was legitimate. I knew it, even if others didn't seem to see it. I just wanted someone to look at me and acknowledge what I was going through, without minimizing my experience or trying to make me feel weak or irrational. I wasn't seeking external validation for my pain, but rather I wanted the people around me to simply understand the weight I carried. The words I heard, the answers I received, often made no sense, because what I truly needed wasn't ready-made solutions, but genuine empathy. I wanted someone to look me in the eye and say, "I see you. I understand the pain you're feeling, and you're not alone." That was all. That would have been enough. But instead, the words often sounded like criticism disguised as advice, or worse, like an attempt to minimize what I was experiencing, as if my pain were something that could be easily resolved. This emptiness, this feeling of being misunderstood, was what hurt me the most, because, deep down, I knew that what I was experiencing wasn't simple. It wasn't just about betrayal or abandonment. It was about the weight of carrying immense pain, feeling like no one around me could see its depth. This made me question, to what extent is our society truly willing to listen to others, to be by someone's side without rushing to fix everything? I didn't want to be fixed. I just wanted to be seen. And maybe, on some level, we all need that. To be heard, to be understood, without judgment. But as the need to be heard became more urgent, I began to realize that perhaps the only person who could truly hear me fully was myself. I had to learn to listen to myself, to validate my own pain, to recognize what I was feeling as legitimate and necessary. And in doing so, I began to understand that healing would come not just from the words of others, but from the recognition that my journey, my pain, my story were valid, and only then would I begin to find the peace I so desperately sought. And that's when God challenged me, not just by forgiving him, but by forgiving myself, realizing that often the greatest prison is not freeing ourselves from the guilt we carry. Throughout that process, I focused so much on forgiving those who hurt me that I didn't realize I was imprisoning myself. The guilt, the feeling of inadequacy, the constant feeling that I could have done more, that I could have seen the signs sooner. All of it became an immense weight that prevented me from moving forward. I blamed myself for feeling what I felt. I blamed myself for not being strong enough. I blamed myself for allowing myself to be hurt. It was as if, by carrying this weight, I was trying to protect the image I had of myself, as a woman who never fails, who never makes mistakes. But the truth God showed me throughout this journey was that it wasn't my fault. I didn't need to carry this burden. I didn't need to live in the shadow of a pain that wasn't mine. The betrayal wasn't a reflection of my own worthlessness, but of choices made by someone else. Realizing this was liberating, yet painful. I was condemning myself for something beyond my control, something happening in a reality I hadn't created. Realizing this made me begin to see the situation differently. I didn't need to blame myself. I didn't need to punish myself. I needed to free myself. It was a difficult decision, But it was the moment I began to truly forgive myself. I realized that my pain wasn't a reflection of weakness, but of my humanity, and that, however difficult it was, I deserved to move forward without carrying this invisible weight. I wanted to be free, free from pain, free from guilt, free from everything that was preventing me from reconnecting with myself. This forgiveness wasn't instantaneous, but it was the first step toward healing. The forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me, for Sarah, who deserved to find peace, for the woman who deserved to rediscover herself without the shadow of suffering. Through this liberation, I began to rebuild my self-esteem. The woman who felt invisible began to realize her worth, and faith, which had previously seemed distant, became an ally again, but now not as a way to protect me from everything, but as a way to give me the strength to continue my journey, to start over. Forgiveness didn't immediately free me from the pain, but it gave me permission to heal. And as I began this process, I realized there was much more to me than I imagined. And it was this awakening, this shift in mindset, that truly began to transform my life. I was afraid to start over, afraid of what others would think of me, afraid of being seen as the woman who couldn't save her marriage. This was one of my biggest insecurities, not because I felt like I'd failed, but because the world, and even some people close to me, had this idea that a woman who can't keep her marriage together is somehow incomplete, as if my identity, my worth, were tied to my relationship with someone else. I knew that if I decided to move on, if I made the decision to start over, many things would change. And worse, I knew that some of these changes were inevitable. I was trapped in this fear of being judged. I wondered, what would people think of me? How would I be perceived if I couldn't save what, in the eyes of many, should be the ultimate goal? The pressure I felt to maintain the appearance of a perfect marriage, a perfect life, was overwhelming. I knew the external expectations weren't fair, but they still affected me. I felt a tremendous responsibility for my own decisions, as if, by failing, I was also failing the expectations others had of me. But at the same time, something inside me began to shift. The pain of betrayal, abandonment, and rejection led me to deep introspection, and it was then that I realized that the only thing that truly mattered was what I thought of myself. I couldn't continue living with the weight of what others thought. The fear of being seen as the woman who failed in her marriage held me captive for a time, but gradually, I freed myself from that idea. Marriage no longer defined who I was, not anymore. Starting over seemed impossible at times. I faced a difficult choice: move forward, embracing the new, or stay in the past, trying to repair something that was already broken. The fear of starting over wasn't just about others' reactions, but about the doubt that I would be able to be happy again, alone. Could I handle the loneliness? Would I be strong enough to rebuild my life without feeling like I was losing the battle? This decision was consuming me, and the pain of the unknown was more intense than I imagined. But when I finally stopped worrying about what others thought and started looking within, I began to realize something. The fear of starting over was actually a reflection of the fear of being free. Free to be who I truly am. Free to make decisions without worrying about the expectations of everyone around me. I knew that by making this decision, I was choosing my own freedom, and that, in itself, was an act of courage. The new beginning would be difficult, but it would be mine. And I was beginning to understand that, in many situations, it's necessary to lose yourself in order to find yourself again. Did you know that in many Christian circles, divorce is still seen as a failure? As if the woman were responsible for everything going wrong? This was something that affected me deeply. At many times I felt like I was the only one carrying the weight of a mistake that wasn't just mine. It wasn't just about the end of a marriage, but about the perception of everyone around me. The feeling of being seen as a failure, as the woman who couldn't save her family, was devastating. I wasn't just dealing with the pain of betrayal and abandonment, but with the judgment of a society that seems to believe divorce is the last thing a woman should choose. The idea that if a marriage fails, the woman is primarily to blame is a mentality that still persists, even in the most devout circles. Often in Christian circles, we're taught to maintain the marriage at all costs, to fight to the end, to forgive, to believe in miracles. Of course, all of this is important, But what happens when that miracle doesn't come? What happens when you've done everything you could, and yet you find yourself in a situation where there's no more room to save what's already broken? The response is often a silent but sharp judgment. I began to feel this weight around me. People's gazes seemed to constantly remind me of my failure. It wasn't just about me, but about how my decision was being viewed by others. What hurt most wasn't just the disapproving looks, but the feeling that, by failing to maintain my marriage, I was also failing in my faith, as if divorce were the greatest evidence that I wasn't doing what God intended. This thought tormented me, but at the same time, I began to question myself. Why should divorce be treated as a shame, a failure? Why couldn't it be seen as a difficult but necessary choice for healing and moving forward? The reality is that society's judgment is often more tied to people's perceptions of marriage than to what's truly best for those involved. I knew the end of my marriage wasn't a reflection of my personal failure, but others didn't always understand. I recognized the weight of expectations, but at the same time, something inside me was beginning to shift. I could no longer carry this guilt. I needed to break free from this mindset that made divorce seem like the only unacceptable thing. I began to understand that true strength lay in making difficult decisions, even when society didn't understand them. I experienced it, the rejection, the judgment, the feeling of being excluded. And do you know what hurt me most? Seeing that, while his mistake was ignored, my suffering became a topic of conversation. What seemed most difficult to deal with wasn't the betrayal itself, but the fact that, instead of being supported, I found myself being judged, almost as if my pain were something inconvenient to others. I was being excluded, not because of what I did, but because of what I was experiencing. The words around me made me feel as if my pain was worthless, as if, by trying to process it, I was disturbing everyone's peace. Every time I spoke about what I was going through, I noticed the discomfort in others' eyes. It was as if my pain were an inconvenience, something I should swallow and carry in silence without bothering anyone. What hurt me most was not just people's indifference, but the fact that, in a community where love for others should be a fundamental principle, I found myself alone. The judgment of those around me made me question everything. What was I doing wrong? Why, when I tried to seek support, was I seen as a problem, while the one who caused me pain went unnoticed? It was as if my pain was unworthy of compassion. The cruelest thing was realizing that, while I tried to rebuild my life, there were those around me who preferred to look the other way, ignoring what was happening. And even if they didn't say it in words, their silence spoke louder than any comment. The worst part was that, being rejected like this, the feeling of loneliness and abandonment intensified even more. I no longer knew who to trust, and what hurt most was realizing that, more often than not, I wasn't being seen as someone in pain, but as a woman who had failed. This made me feel even more invisible, as if, instead of being welcomed, I was being pushed to the margins, like a shadow people preferred to avoid. And through it all, one question remained constant in my mind. If I had been stronger, wiser, would I have avoided all of this? Was I to blame for feeling this way? But in the midst of it all, something inside me began to shift. I stopped being the woman who worried about other people's opinions. I became the woman who knew her true identity in Christ. That was the turning point. When I stopped seeking validation from others, I began to realize that my strength came not from external approval, but from the certainty of who I am in God's eyes. The pain, the rejection, everything I went through became a catalyst for a new perspective. I no longer needed to define myself by the mistakes or failures of others. I was more than that. That's when I understood that my pain didn't define me, that what I had experienced didn't determine my future. I learned to own my own story. Pain was part of my journey, but not my essence. What I chose to do with it, how to transform it into strength and learning, was what truly mattered. I would no longer be a prisoner of what had happened, but would rise, stronger and more aware of who I was. And this freedom came when I realized that my identity lay not in the failures of the past, but in the faith that sustained me, in the woman I was becoming. And what seemed like the end was actually the beginning of a new journey. When everything seemed to be falling apart around me, when the pain seemed unbearable and I no longer knew where to turn, it was at that precise moment that I began to see something new emerging. The pain, though intense, didn't destroy me. It renewed me. I didn't know how, but little by little, I began to feel a strength I'd never experienced before, a strength coming from within, which made me believe that, despite everything, there was something greater happening in my life. I was no longer alone on this journey, for my faith, which had previously seemed shaken, returned with renewed intensity. I began to understand that, amidst the suffering, there was a purpose. I knew God was guiding me, leading me to a place of healing and transformation, and this gave me the hope I so desperately needed. Today, I feel stronger, more connected to my faith and to God's purpose for my life. I realize that even in the most difficult situations, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, and that overcoming comes not only from what we've been through, but from how we choose to deal with what life throws at us. This new mindset, this transformation, has shown me that life is made of new beginnings, and that the end of one chapter can be just the door to a new beginning. If you're here, you may have experienced something similar. I want you to know that you're not alone. And most importantly, your pain doesn't define who you are. No matter what happened in your past, you are much more than the difficult moments you've faced. I know what it's like to feel like we're on the edge of the abyss, but the truth is, when we hit rock bottom, that's when we find our true strength. If you identified with my story, if you feel like you still need support to heal, know that I'm here. And you also have a support network around you, perhaps even in unexpected places. Let's go together on this journey of healing and rebirth.